When describing my grandfather, John J. Murtagh, the phrase people used most often was service to others. Who was he, and why was service to others such an appropriate description of my grandfather? John Joseph Murtagh was born to Edward and Catherine Delaney Murtagh in 1910 in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. He was their eldest surviving child. Not a lot is known about his early years. Like many of his generation, his formal education ended early, but he had a lot of practical learning since he had to grow up early and help his father support the family. Learning about ancient history and advanced algebra was not going to help feed the family. He learned instead about the food business and about basic carpentry. The most important skill he may have learned was what we now refer to as networking with others. John was a favorite of his grandmother Maria Delaney because he brought the neighborhood gossip to her while his brothers were silent in that area. The winters in St. John were very cold. Most of his friends often did not have mittens. Because his mother and his grandmother Maria Delaney knitted, he had extra mittens which he would give away to his friends. We know that for a time John's father Edward sold food off a wagon. He would buy a wagon load of a single item, and John would go out on the streets in the wagon selling the food. He had horns that he would blow to let people know what he was selling. Different horns were used for different foods, such as fish. Sometimes they sold strawberries or potatoes that came down the St. John River on riverboats. Later, his father opened a small store for himself. John remembered going around the east and west sides of St. John taking orders for food and returning home about 8 p.m. Edward would make up the orders and John, with the horse and wagon, would make the deliveries the next day after school. John recalled walking in front of the horse-drawn wagon carrying a lantern so they could see where they were going. Some orders were telephoned in or mailed in. The people did not have the transportation to bring home the food themselves. John was an athletic and handsome young man. He liked rowing, swimming, and competitive speed ice skating. In 1926, he entered the World Amateur Speed Skating Championships in St. John, New Brunswick. John's uniform was Long John's, dyed by his mother. He did well enough to be invited to Lake Placid, New York, to skate in championship events there. Because these were difficult times for the family, however, John was told by his father they could not afford for him to travel and compete. This was a big disappointment for John. John's family was not the only family struggling financially. The Canadian economy was depressed in the 1920s. In order to keep their customers, the storekeepers, including Edward, would extend credit through the summer, as St. John was a winter port and did most of its business when the other Canadian ports were frozen over. In the winter, the ships arrived and the dock workers returned to work and were able to pay their bills. But during this economic depression, this time the ships did not come back. The men remained out of work, and the storekeepers who extended credit failed. Edward eventually decided to emigrate to the United States, which was doing well economically. In 1926, he left for Massachusetts, leaving 16-year-old John to close down the family grocery business, collect debts as best he could, and see that the family of 6 got by on $10 a week. By age 16, John suddenly became the man of the family. In 1927, John Murtagh joined his father, and then later the rest of the family followed on the steamship the Calvin Austin. Soon after he arrived in the United States, John got a job working at the A&P Tea Company store. It was here he first met Leela, a young lady who had recently arrived from Nova Scotia, Canada. Their courtship lasted for several years. By 1929, he was managing small A&P stores. Later, he was a foreman of a weather stripping company. Perhaps due to the Great Depression, they delayed getting married. In 1935, the economy appeared to be improving, and John and Leela got married. Immediately after he got married, he left for New York City to help weather strip the Empire State Building and had to leave Leela behind. In 1936, their first child, my father, was born. He was the first of what would eventually be 6 children. During the first years of marriage, John and Leela moved to different parts of Framingham. Eventually, the Murtaghs moved to Morris Road in Framingham, Massachusetts. Mr. Dunlap owned a group of houses on Morris Road that had been foreclosed during the Great Depression. John Murtagh, who was by that time a general contractor, was hired to renovate these homes for resale. In payment, he was given one of these houses. That house, 49 Morris Road, would remain in the family for many years. In 1939, right before World War II started, John became a citizen of the United States. At the beginning of World War II, the National Guard was activated. Not long after the National Guard was activated, the Massachusetts State Guard was formed. John was part of a medical unit for the State Guard. He managed ambulance services for the unit. My father remembers driving down the highway in one of the ambulances and being allowed to turn on the siren. During his time with the Massachusetts State Guard, he responded to the tragic Coconut Grove nightclub fire in Boston in 1942. That was the deadliest nightclub fire in history, claiming 492 lives. When the U.S. entered World War II, that meant upheaval for the family, as it did for many others. John was drafted in the U.S. Army and left for Europe. Leela was left to raise their 3 children all alone. Edward's 4 sons served. John served in the European theater. He was a decorated veteran who participated in the D-Day invasion, the liberation of Paris, and the Battle of the Bulge. Though the Great Depression was long over, money was still very tight for the family. Leela was only getting $48 a month in assistance while her husband was in the Army. Edward and his wife Catherine were not well off, so they could only provide limited help. My father remembers going to the nearby Foster farm as a boy and helping out. His pay was food from the farm, which was very appreciated by his mother. Despite food rations and very modest income, the family made it through the war years. The Boston Globe newspaper included an article about a Framingham soldier, John J. Murtagh, turning down the Purple Heart because the wound was only a scratch, when in fact the opposite was true. The real reason he turned down the Purple Heart was that it would have generated the dreaded telegram that would have arrived at Leela's home that was used by the War Department to tell a relative that a soldier was killed or wounded, with no details. Leela learned that John was wounded from a telephone call from the Fort Devens Hospital, that he was back in the USA but wounded. He did not stay in the hospital as long as the doctors wanted him to, since he said he needed to earn money for his family. He came home with small pieces of shrapnel in his body. On the first day of the Battle of the Bulge, A soldier near him had stepped on a mine called a bouncing Betty. John was on the ground or crouching, so he did not get the full blast, but was still wounded. Shrapnel was still coming out of his body decades later. After he left the Fort Devens Hospital, he went back to his contracting business. He was soon elected to be the commander of a local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. In 1949, he took over the Office of Veterans Services for the town of Framingham. He also served on many committees at the local, state, and federal levels on a wide range of areas such as Veterans Affairs, Employee Relations, Head Start Education, retirement programs, and credit unions. At the invitation of the President, he went several times to Washington, D.C. to attend conferences for hiring the handicapped. My father grew up with the impression that no veteran in need, either living in Framingham or even just passing through, would ever be ignored. He was politically well connected and was able to make things happen. My father learned a lot about town politics by watching his father negotiating and pushing for initiatives that made Framingham a better place. Framingham was a town that had 25,000 inhabitants. It boasted at the time that it was the largest town in New England with an unlimited town meeting structure. In other words, most financial items and related matters that would come up were decided by whoever showed up at the town meetings. My father said that John would take him to town meetings and he would sit in the balcony and watch the political process. It had a profound effect on my father. My father remembers that his father would stop by the neighborhood Irish bar for a social drink for about 30 minutes after work. He would see influential people of the town there, and he would say that he would accomplish more there than at work. It was an Irish networking opportunity that he excelled in. In 1954, he lost his wife of 19 years. He had 5 children, including his 2-year-old daughter Kathy and 6-year-old daughter Susan. This was a difficult time period. John learned to cook, and it became one of his hobbies. In 1957, John married Rose Haley, who was also a World War II veteran. Rose was an ally in his efforts to make a difference in Framingham. Framingham was still a town back then, not a city, and she knew a lot of people. From this marriage, they had a daughter, Rosemary. In addition to his growing influence in Framingham, John's influence on the state level was also growing. In 1967, he was appointed to the Massachusetts Emergency Ration Board by Governor Volpe. The board was tasked with determining how scarce resources would be distributed in an emergency. John wanted to make sure that those veterans who died were not forgotten, even veterans from the Revolutionary War. To ensure that veterans were not forgotten, John Murtagh followed the practice of decorating the graves of veterans in Framingham on Memorial Day. He would place thousands of flags each spring. John drafted his children into helping to place the flags, and that it became a family tradition. In 2017, some of his descendants celebrated his life by continuing the tradition of placing flags at veterans' graves. John helped organize and run the 4th of July parades in Framingham for many years and was the Grand Marshal of the first Framingham Flag Day celebration in 1987. He was also one of the organizers for Framingham's 275th year celebration in 1975 and was Mr. Framingham. There are many stories about John J. Murtagh. One family favorite involved John's love of his Santa role. My father recalls that his father would play the role of Santa at the annual VFW Christmas parade. John would ride in a red convertible throwing candy to kids who were along the parade route. Before the start of one of those parades, John, dressed in his Santa costume, drove to his house on 49 Morris Road and went into the house to do something. He later came out and drove off. The neighbors' kids saw this and were distressed that Santa went only to the Murtagh's house. The kids were crying and the parents were furious. Earlier I mentioned the flag tradition. My father tells a story that at one point when he was young, his father took him to an auction in South Framingham. At one point, the American flag was put up for auction. John stood up and objected to the flag being auctioned. He stated that too many soldiers had died defending that flag and that it should not be put up for auction. The auctioneer was taken aback, but finally approached him and gave him the flag and asked that John handle the flag in a respectful manner. Rosemary remembers her father being the only man who would paint a house in a dress shirt and seersucker pants. This would be the same outfit he would wear when he went to the beach. In 1982, after 33 years of service, John J. Murtagh retired as Framingham's veterans agent. In 1994, he passed away. He is buried with his first wife, Leela, and his second wife, Rose, in Framingham, Massachusetts. While he may be gone, his memory and his spirit of service to others still lives on in his descendants.